the beat-em-up, the undisputed most popular and timeless video game genre ever created. No puzzle game even comes close to memorizing the patterns of a level 5 brawler boss. No platformer asks for the same precision that a death-defying jump over a rolling beat-em-up barrel demands. And while some may boast about the hollow spectacle of any modern action game all day long, the fact is none of them can compare to the thrilling final set pieces of 90s belt-scrollers. See? I mean, you can't top that! But while Technos' Double Dragon was responsible for truly starting the craze, it was Capcom's 1989 classic Final Fight that established many of the genre's most long-standing tenets that are still being implemented today. The creation and evolution of the franchise also happens to be a fascinating one, as its origins accidentally spawned a fighting game revolution, fused together the worlds of two different series, and generated many sequels, spin-offs, and the occasional mistake. So, let's enter the hard streets of Metro City as I discuss the history of Final Fight. In 1986, Capcom took notice of the success Nintendo was having in the home video game market with the original Famicom. So they started work on their own custom arcade board to similarly offer their own unique arcade experiences via big advancements in both graphics and sound. Not only would this help establish Capcom with their own brand, it would increase productivity, as all their arcade teams could then use the same board, dubbed the CPS-1, to share various tricks and techniques with one another. The first game to use said technology was Forgotten Worlds, a macho, pulse-pounding shoot-'em-up that really showcased what the board could do. Following that, many of the same team members like Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda were debating on what was next, which would ultimately be informed by the booming popularity of Billy and Jimmy Lee, the Double Dragons. Unfortunately, these very early origins of Final Fight are still a bit muddied, as several different Capcom employees all recall things a bit differently. Nishitani, the game's director, has said that Capcom USA had put out a request for a direct sequel to Big Red Button Basher Street Fighter, something that was also backed up by Noritaka Funamizu. And while that was the plan for a hot second, the team had some misgivings. They looked at the booming popularity of the beat-em-up in Japanese arcades and basically ignored the request, feeling that making a Double Dragon competitor was the smarter move. Yoshiki Okamoto, the head of the arcade division at the time, tells it slightly differently. He said following Forgotten Worlds, the team took a research trip to American arcades to study the latest trends, and to then base their next project on those findings. But since Double Dragon was also all the rage in the US, as well as several martial arts movies making big bucks in US cinemas, the team were logically motivated to make something that captured that same spirit, hence Final Fight.
Fighting doesn't solve anything. Oh, well, neither does palm trees, Ma.
Okamoto then went on to explain that once development started getting into gear, Capcom executives mandated it should be renamed to Street Fighter, as it would add a bit of brand recognition, regardless of it having very little connection to the one-on-one fighter. The team did so by calling it Street Fighter 89, but when displaying an in-production cabinet at a trade show, the feedback from arcade operators and onlookers was one of confusion, as they weren't sure if it was supposed to be a sequel or spin-off or whatever, so the Street Fighter branding was dropped. Oh, but we're not done with all the slightly different variations of the game's inception. Because in contrast to the previous two tales, Akira Akiman Yasuda, via the Street Fighter Cross Tekken art book, said that Final Fight's origins were something else altogether. The team were originally going full steam ahead with a traditional Street Fighter sequel right after Forgotten Worlds, and even started design work on a few characters and concepts. But when they sat down to look at the logistics of making 8 huge sprites with hundreds of frames of animation each, along with backgrounds, effects, bosses, etc., it would actually require more memory than Capcom was willing to spring for. See, Japan was going through a computer chip shortage at that time, so if the team wanted to release a big bombastic Street Fighter sequel, it was going to have to be greatly compromised. So they decided to then shift genres and make a beat-em-up instead, as it would save on memory thanks to a more conservative amount of playable characters. Akiman also confirmed that early on, yes, the game was called Street Fighter 89, but instead of feedback coming from a trade show, it was Capcom executives who felt that the brawling gameplay was too different to carry the same moniker, so it was at their behest that the name was changed. Now, listen, when you look back at the past and comb through old articles or ask game developers questions 40-something years later, you're gonna run into these discrepancies. All these versions of the origin of Final Fight might be accurate, inaccurate, or a hearty mix of them all. What we know for certain, though, is that from the very start, Street Fighter and Final Fight were intrinsically linked, something Capcom would go very hard on in the subsequent decades. As for the core development of the game itself, Yoshiki Okamoto wanted as many titles coming out of the arcade division to be as flashy and as cinematic as possible, which included introductory cutscenes, backstories, and more fleshed out personalities for the various heroes and villains, something that would shape many Capcom franchises from then on out. With that mandate, Nishitani asked his team to really lean on American style and trends for the story, setting, and the cast of characters, taking influence from all over popular culture, which is something they definitely took to heart. The 1984 Walter Hill film Streets of Fire is often cited as Final Fight's main source of inspiration, so much so that some have considered it a straight-up carbon copy, something that Nishitani, to this day, still pleads ignorance of. And while the film must have played a part in the broader strokes, the rest of the creative corners were filled with references to American hair metal bands, homages to professional wrestling, and some things that were uniquely all its own. To give a quick rundown, Final Fight centered around Metro City, a fictional crime-ridden burg that's under the violent thumb of the Mad Gear Gang, who would go to any lengths to get their way. Their way then became a bit harder to get when the newly elected mayor and former pro wrestler Mike Real Graps Hagar moved into office, and whose first order of business was to not take anyone else's shit. Of course, the Mad Gear and their leader, the affluent and crossbow-wielding Belger, took exception to this. And so to put pressure on Mike to, look the other way, they kidnapped his daughter, the lovely Jessica Hagar. With the police unwilling or unable to mount any sort of rescue, Mike then hits the streets with Jessica's boyfriend Cody and his training partner Guy in a daring attempt to bring her home and stomp out the Mad Gear forever. Unlike Billy and Jimmy, who are indistinguishable in playstyle, Final Fight offered 3 distinct characters who all had strengths and weaknesses, which formed the triangle of archetypes that many later brawlers copied. Hagar was slow but powerful and had extra throw options at his disposal. Guy was faster but with less power behind his punches, which was made up by being able to jump off walls. While Cody was a balanced mix of the two with the added ability to swipe with knives. Cody always loved his slashy-washy.
Now stand back, I gotta practice my stabbing.
While the gameplay was kept relatively in line with other brawlers, Final Fight added a smattering of new techniques, none more impactful than the Mega Crush. This was a powerful move that would interrupt almost all enemy offense and get you out of jams the instant you press jump and attack together, with the only real caveat being a small health reduction. Not only did this balance out the move, it was a sneaky way to slowly reduce the player's health to get them to pump in more quarters. The Mega Crush was also key to fending off the likes of 2P, Bill Bull, Poison, and the Andore Dynasty, who all stood in your way throughout 6 levels strewn across the Metro City map. In the end, you came face to face with the big bad Belger, who honestly wasn't all that bad. He first appears in a wheelchair avec Jessica, and then starts pelting you with crossbow bolts before hopping around like a madman until a deadly, very movie-esque coup de grace is struck, ending his evil scheme.
Damn! He ain't gonna be in Rush Hour 3.
When you compared Final Fight to the likes of any other beat-em-up that was in the arcades circa 1989, you immediately saw the difference that the CPS-1 board made. The punchy sound effects, memorable music, and massive character sprites that would gradually fill the screen during the action turned a lot of heads. Because of this, Final Fight became an instant success, shipping over 30,000 machines across the globe, was the highest grossing Japanese arcade game of 1990, and in general became Capcom's biggest hit ever up until that point. With being such a blockbuster hit, ports were ordered pretty much immediately, and it's here where Final Fight's franchise trajectory shifts a little bit into an unexpected direction. In the late 80s, Capcom had a strong relationship with Sega, releasing solid home ports of other arcade titles like Strider and the aforementioned Forgotten Worlds for the Genesis. Nintendo, however, looking to bolster the popularity of its then upcoming Super NES/Famicom, sought to wrap up exclusive 16-bit rights for Final Fight, a move that paid off for everyone involved, except for maybe the gamers that bought it. Capcom's home division were given a very strict deadline to port the massive arcade game onto a tiny SNES cartridge, and while on a visual and auditory level they mostly succeeded, the port lost a few features from its arcade cousin during the transition. And when I say a few features, I mean a whole Andori ass full of them. While slight downgrades were of course expected, along with the same type of censoring many other games went through at the time, what was less expected was the complete removal of Guy as a playable character, the axing of the industrial level and its end boss Rolento, the enemy sprite count being drastically reduced, and worst of all, no 2-player co-op, something I, and many others, don't think it should have ever shipped without. The inability for 2 buddies teaming up to take on the Mad Gear also had another negative effect, which was that it was almost unreasonable to beat, because unlike the arcade, you had a very limited set of continues. Hell, years later there's even been some seasoned video game vets who just couldn't rise up to the challenge. Now, lots of later Capcom arcade beat-em-ups got ported to the SNES with co-op and most content intact, so this was just a case of too short a deadline and too little familiarity with the new hardware. And while it frustrated a good portion of fans due to its lack of content and insane difficulty, it didn't seem to bother Nintendo or Capcom too much, because just like the arcade original, Final Fight smashed sales records on the Super NES/Famicom, selling over 1.5 million copies on the machine, which was an incredible number for such a compromised port and so early in the console's life. Now, if you didn't have the hottest 16-bit consoles on the market and instead were into weird crap like clunky home computers, you still had a few options if you wanted to see what all the Final Fight hype was about. There were a few decent efforts like the Amiga or Atari ST versions, but there were some less than decent ones like the ZX Spectrum, Armstrad CPC, or the mangled Lego-looking mess that was the Commodore 64 port. Next up, while it was unavailable and obscure to much of the world, the Japanese-only Sharp X68000 version, for my money, was the most accurate to the arcade, with the only differences being less enemies on screen and its slightly remixed soundtrack. Shame this one wasn't released outside of Japan during the 90s, cause hell, I mean, look at it. Capcom were still pretty chummy with Nintendo during this porting period, but Sega, however, sneakily slid into Capcom's DMs to make a deal for a Final Fight port of their own. Of course, they had to navigate around the pre-existing deal with Nintendo, which they did by making sure it was well outside the launch period of the SNES port, designing it for a CD-based console, and having Sega and not Capcom themselves publish the port. The result was 1993's Final Fight CD, which included a lot of the cut content, Guy, the industrial section, and the two-player co-op, and added a few bells and whistles of its own. While the visuals and sound effects were a step down from what was seen and heard on the SNES, the freshly recorded CD quality OST impressed with its dancier feel and more polished production values. A new and very hilarious animated intro and outro was also added, because really, what's the point of a Sega CD game without it? And it certainly made some choices in regards to its voice acting.
Guy, Jessica was kidnapped.
Jessica?
My sweetheart since childhood.
Finally, a unique time attack mode was squeezed in as a bonus, where you were tasked with taking out waves of baddies before, well, time runs out. While nothing mind-blowing, it's still kinda wild to see all new backgrounds were created just for this mode, showing that the team Sega had contracted definitely went the extra mile, although it's kinda lame that Poison and Roxy still had their sprites altered, but I mean, at least they were in the damn thing. Rounding out the ports, we have the curious curio that is Final Fight. Guy. This was a bizarre re-release of the SNES version, which hit Japanese store shelves only a few months later, and just happens to have the most lateral changes to a follow-up ever conceived. Hagar is retained, but Cody is now MIA, and replaced with his Bushinryu buddy, hence the kind of awkward game title. There were a few added bits of text explaining Cody's absence, which, I don't know, makes this a dream match or fight? More difficulty settings were implemented, however, which did help things somewhat, along with a few new power-ups, but that was pretty much it. The industrial stage, Poison and Roxy, and the two-player co-op were all still missing. Like, what the hell was the point even? While this was sold in Japan, it first came to the US as a Blockbuster rental exclusive, before eventually getting a smaller limited run, making it one of the rarer SNES titles that's absolutely not worth that price. My only thought here was that since the original Super Nintendo port was so popular, Capcom decided to sweatily crap this one out to capitalize on said success, and implemented the barest bone changes they could before shoving it out the door. This was not dissimilar to how they pumped out Street Fighter II revisions in such short succession to keep the gravy train a-rollin'. Like, they could have figured out how to get all three characters or the co-op in there, but that would have taken just a little bit too much time. Let's move it, people! These filthy gamers want their Metro City street meat now! By the time all these ports were coming out though, Capcom, and specifically the team that created Final Fight, had struck gold or platinum with Street Fighter II, selling over 75,000 arcade units worldwide and well over 6 million copies on the SNES, which meant they would be very busy with that franchise for the foreseeable future. That put Final Fight in a bit of a weird place. The original development team wasn't available, but the franchise was still a big seller, which meant Capcom had to find a way to keep things fresh. And to do that, Final Fight was going to have to go global. With Nishitani and his team transitioning exclusively to fighting games, the staff that developed the 16-bit port of Final Fight were immediately saddled with making a sequel that would skip arcades altogether and pile drive the SNES once again. Now, why, you may ask? I'm not sure, actually. I couldn't find any snippet or interview where an old Capcom employee shed light on that decision, but I have to assume that the first port's platinum selling status played a lot into it. With more time now available for development, since they no longer had to rush for launch, the team were able to come to grips with the technical aspects of the Super NES, and thankfully were able to deliver a sequel that improved upon the first port's massive shortcomings. 3 fighters were now available, although some fans were let down that Cody and Guy weren't a part of this new trio. Instead, Maki Genryusai, Guy's childhood friend and training partner, enlisted Hagar's help to rescue her sister and father, who, try to be shocked here, the tattered remnants of the Mad Gear gang have kidnapped. Carlos Miyamoto, friend of Hagar, just happened to be crashing at his house when Maki's call came in, and having nothing better to do, pledges his sword to the cause. Cody's absence is explained away by him and Jessica being on a vacation somewhere. Oh, maybe at the White Lotus? Oh, I'd love to watch that! While Guy is off on some vague training mission and simply couldn't be reached. Like, what? I mean, this is his master and girlfriend that were absconded with. Like, page the dude or something. Anyway, the global setting I mentioned earlier is in regards to Final Fight no longer being constrained by the trash-ridden and pothole-plagued streets of Metro City, as the Mad Gear gang had somehow opened cells all over the world, which included, but was not limited to, Hong Kong, England, Italy, and Japan, with a few of them hiding cheeky little references and cameos. In total, there are about 6 main stages and 2 bonus ones, which meant that this made up for the missing 4th stage from the first game's port, and the team even went the extra mile by including Rolento as the boss of Italy, although strangely his name was shortened to Rolent for some reason. While Poison and Roxy don't appear in any version of Final Fight 2, a new female duo did, Mary and Eliza, which, while really neat, was also pretty pointless, as again, Capcom USA requested them to be changed to Leon and Robert, another big downgrade. Of course, to take on this worldwide version of Mad Gear, 2 players would be ideal, as cooperation does indeed make it happen. And mercifully, Capcom made sure of it this time around. Unfortunately, gameplay-wise, Final Fight 2 doesn't really make any advances over its predecessor, other than Hagar's pile driver being upgraded to a spinning version as a nod to Zangief. The story is also lacking as well, as there's no real reason given as to why Mad Gear kidnapped 2 tertiary characters that had nothing to do with the first game, as well as the final boss, Retu, having no clear motivations either. However, the vibe of Final Fight 1 was retained here, as the sequel still had a gritty look and feel, but felt a little bit more 90s thanks to the character designs. The selection of exotic locales also made the game feel a bit fresh when it came to the aesthetics, and of course, each one was accompanied by another stellar BGM that sounds so distinctly Capcom. To reiterate, Final Fight 2 was only ever released on the SNES, and even to this day it's never been made available anywhere outside of Nintendo virtual libraries, which is a little bit odd considering Capcom's kink for constantly re-releasing titles from their retro catalog. Fortunately for us, back in 1993 at least, it was a big year for Final Fight in general, because not only did it get a sequel, but another sequel, or a remake maybe? Well, whatever it was, fans the world over were treated to something that was quite mighty. By 1993, the Super Nintendo had already been out for 3 years, but Capcom were still putting out titles for its aging predecessor, I guess because the console had treated them so well during the 8-bit 80s. One of the last 3 games they produced for it, along with Chip 'n Dale 2 and Mega Man 6, was the oddest one of the bunch, and that was Mighty Final Fight. This was more of a charming what-if remake/sequel to the original arcade game, much in the same style as Kid Dracula or One Paku Graffiti, although, in my humble opinion, this is the best version of that type of cutesy reimagining. Mighty Final Fight poses the question, what if Belger didn't actually die, but instead was rebuilt as a cyborg? 'Cause why the hell not? And instead of being a purely evil gangster this time around, he just wants the adoration of Metro City's citizens, and thus decides to kidnap Jessica again, because her beaming radiance will somehow gain him likes and followers. It's obviously all very tongue-in-cheek and contains several humorous cutscenes that are there to tell you, nah man, don't take it seriously, this is all jokes. Including pre-boss fight conversations that, depending on your answer, can hurt the boss's feelings, and therefore life bar. Mwah! All 3 characters are present as well, but sadly, there's no 2-player co-op, which was probably a big ask for the NES in a technical sense, thanks to the beefy sprites and animation, for 8-bit standards anyway. Thankfully, the co-op isn't missed too much here because Mighty Final Fight was tuned to favor single-player play, and has a bit more of an action game feel since you progressively unlock more moves through a simple XP system. This makes playing as Hagar, Cody, and Guy a bit of a different experience, as they all gain their own unique moves, and you can make slightly different story choices along the way to boot. The game also sports another phenomenal soundtrack, right up there with some of the best tunes of the later entries in the Mega Man series, and gosh darn it, the whole thing is just fun to play. In fact, the only real knock against Mighty Final Fight is that it keeps you wanting more, as you get the feeling that Capcom were really onto something here, and if it had a few more features, content, and maybe that co-op, it could have been an unmitigated NES classic. Thankfully, such a thing exists in the realm of fan games, and that is Mighty Final Fight Forever, which includes said co-op mode, more techniques, levels, and boss fights, along with a ton of unlockable mighty heroes that are brand new to the game, so definitely check that one out if you have any reverence for the original NES release. Having a single year packed with 2 Final Fight entries is something that would never occur again, because ironically, the fighting game, spearheaded by many of the same people that created Final Fight, progressively started to push the brawler out of the arcades more and more. So, it would take another 3 years before the franchise would return again, and if it was going to make an impact, it was going to need to get a whole lot tougher. Released at the very tail end of 1995 in Japan and early 1996 elsewhere, Final Fight 3, or Final Fight Tough, did what the first sequel should have, which was to shake up the formula a little bit, and even though it's not a perfect beat 'em up, it's one of my personal favorites. Taking place in Metro City years after the first game, 3 sees Hagar teaming up once again with 2 newcomers, Metro City cop Lucia Morgan and a crusty, bitter old Dean. Oh, and how could I forget? Capcom, perhaps realizing the mistake they made in FF2, saw fit to finally bring back Guy, complete with his Street Fighter Alpha sneakers and fighting stance. The story is pretty straightforward, but thankfully it's improved over FF2 in that the Skullcross gang, who stepped in after the vacuum from Mad Gear's destruction, initiates a city-wide attack, and it's up to our quartet to take them down. No kidnappings, no opaque motivations, just skull-breaking action. It feels like everything Capcom could have done to expand Final Fight's core gameplay was implemented here, as pretty much every aspect saw a new wrinkle or layer added to it. players can now dash or back hop, which led to additional attacks. Special move inputs, much like Street Fighters, were included and could be used at any time without a life-draining penalty. Each character now had several throws at their disposal, along with new combo attacks for weapons specific to them. Hagar could swing around a pipe multiple times in a far-reaching arc, Guy could do big damage with nunchucks, Dean threw a powered-up hammer, and Lucia could dish out some capital punishment with a billy club. Super moves were another big addition that was, again, obviously inspired by fighting games. As you took down enemies, you filled up a meter that would briefly flash when filled, and if you entered in your unique command, the screen would freeze as you laid into your opponent with moves like Hagar's devastating final hammer.
That's what we like to call big damage.
The changes weren't just relegated to just the combat either, as Final Fight 3 featured a somewhat interconnected map that consisted of dozens and dozens of rooms and routes, with some being pretty hard to find. If you broke open certain doors or barriers, you could avoid bosses, fight alternative ones, and in some instances, skip entire stages. A lot of these alternative routes were not obvious, as there was no big "go" or "enter here" signs at any point, which made finding all of them really fun. Those were the days, weren't they? Before yellow paint made navigating a level idiot-proof.
Wait, where do I go now?
Mostly. And in a complete reversal of the rush job that was done on Final Fight 1 SNES, not only were 4 playable characters available, as well as 2-player co-op, FF3 added CPU co-op as a bonus. So if you didn't have a buddy in the room with you, you could still do some tag teaming. There's gotta be a better way to say that. I mean, sure, the artificial intelligence wasn't exactly intelligent no matter what the setting was on, as it always died before you got to the final level, but it was still a cool little innovation nonetheless. Despite all this great stuff, however, FF3 still had some blemishes, but thankfully to the majority of most fans, it was forgivable stuff. Perhaps due to all the sprites and special moves going off, along with all the triggers for different routes, performance-wise, Final Fight 3 chugged, especially in certain sections. Now, it was the same type of slow-mo typified in other 16-bit games that looked kinda cool at times, but it happened so often that it could get kind of annoying. There's also the matter of the art style, which, as you can see, adopted a brighter, almost anime-like look, most likely influenced from the Street Fighter Alpha series that was going on at the same time. This is obviously a subjective thing, and I'm talking for myself here, but yeah, I prefer the grittier, slightly darker color palette of Final Fight 2. Although FF3 does get points by including female gang member Mei in all versions, completely unchanged. Finally, a dub for equality. The last point of contention that most fans have with this one, though, is the difficulty, which is to say, it's not difficult at all. Even on the hardest setting, FF3 is a cakewalk compared to the last 2 games, and this is due to a variety of reasons. Firstly, the playable heroes are over-equipped with everything they can do, while the enemies rely on the same old tricks and attack patterns they were using in the late 80s. Once again though, it's fans to the rescue. You can find hacks that fix both the game's performance woes and its difficulty, or lack thereof. And it does this through a litany of changes that sound a bit on the intimidating side, but at least it now truly earns the game's Japanese subtitle of Final Fight Tough. But FF3, for as much as it did well, didn't really move the needle much in terms of revolutionizing the brawler and seeing the same big sales success that the genre had enjoyed in the early 90s. In fact, Capcom stopped making beat-em-ups just 1 year later with Battle Circuit, as by 1997, in terms of mainstream appeal, the belt had finally stopped scrolling. But then, in 1999, maybe in response to the arcade landscape changing the way it did, Capcom Japan and a small team at Capcom USA decided to collaborate on a spin-off that would hopefully revitalize Final Fight by becoming something completely different yet painfully familiar. Final Fight Revenge is indeed a special case, and while not spectacular either as a bad game or a good one, it's very unique in how and why it was developed. So if you want a further deep dive into that, including info direct from the people that made it, please do refer to my What Happened episode. Unfortunately, regardless of how it turned out in the end, it is one of those spin-off games that never really got a chance, as its initial arcade run was minuscule in Japan and pretty much non-existent in the rest of the world, so truly a smaller-than-life release. There was, of course, the Sega Saturn port, which, to its credit, was arcade perfect, but again, was never released outside Japan, and even if it did, if it was for the Saturn, well, that was long dead in the West by that point. Hell, by mid-2000, when the port was released, the Dreamcast chances of bouncing back were already looking pretty dire. So, for decades, many fans never even got to try this bizarre little side story until advances in both the internet and emulation came along, and what they would eventually find was, interesting. Simply put, FF Revenge is a fairly basic 3D fighting game with Final Fight 1 characters, almost like a remake in a way, especially since it was released in arcades 10 years after the original. I think it's an absolute shame that it didn't just take characters from all over the franchise like Maki, Carlos, or Dean and just plop them all into a big massive dream match, but what can you do? In terms of gameplay and feel, the closest thing I can compare it to is the Street Fighter EX series, but even that is being very generous, as Revenge feels clunkier in about every way, and also features some of the very worst music in Capcom history. It'll be a cold day in hell if any of that makes its way into the Street Fighter VI jukebox. Now, while this next thing doesn't excuse Revenge of those admittedly pretty bad problems, I will say it absolutely gets a ton of mileage out of just being really, really dumb. Weapons are strewn about every stage. Pick these up and you can initiate multi-hitting combos. And while there's the usual suspects like swords, pipes, and etc., there's also freeze guns, bazookas, flamethrowers, chainsaws, grenades, just about anything you can think of. All told, there's 25 frickin' weapons in this game, which can lead to all types of stupid shenanigans. For no damage! And that's not even accounting for the super combos. Cody does his best Kenshiro impression. Rolento pilots a helicopter, Poison knocks you out with various sexy photos that would make Tony Storm blush, and Hagar literally pile drives you through the planet.
Oh my god! What's that, dude?
All these supers have a knockout variation that produces a few funny additional effects, which is a nice little touch, but beyond that, it still is a pretty standard 3D fighter that you'd typically see in the late 90s. What's not so typical is the end boss, which, if you didn't know already, is Zombie Belger, who is exactly what he says he is on the tin. A resurrected corpse that has Dalsim-like extendo limbs, can self-destruct at will, and whose body parts can be used as melee weapons. Defeat him within the walls of the local Metro City Blood Palace, and you can earn a brief ending cinema of very little consequence. That is, except for poisons. This ending attempts to try and explain Cody's prison stint during the events of Street Fighter Alpha 3 by Poison and her Mad Gear buddies somehow pinning an unspecified crime on him. Not sure why Hagar couldn't have just investigated that a little bit more than not at all, but I don't think this is canon for obvious reasons. at the very least, it's neat seeing them try to connect things back to Street Fighter, even if it was never followed up on, and not even by the company that made it initially. Because this small team at Capcom USA, which was rebranded to Production Studio 8, got the chance to work on another Final Fight game a few years later, which unfortunately remains the last wholly new entry in the franchise. Again, I've already covered the development of this one in grueling detail over on What Happened, so if you're still like, why, how, and huh? In regards to Final Fight Streetwise's existence, well, the answers might be contained in there. As a very brief refresher though, the original pitch Capcom USA had made was a more unique but still traditional side-scrolling brawling affair, but this time in 3D, playing more akin to the likes of Dynamite Cop or Gekido on the PS1. However, this version was scrapped for various, very stupid reasons, and the team were essentially forced to restart and make something closer to Grand Theft Auto in the ludicrous hope that it would help to sell more copies. Which it didn't. The game got lambasted in reviews for such things as poor camera controls, buggy gameplay, a broken save system, lack of classic playable heroes, and a cliched script and story. The fact is, it didn't please GTA fans, and certainly didn't please most Final Fight fans, as it sidelined all the characters they had come to know and love to focus entirely on Cody's never-before-mentioned little brother, Kyle. In this new story, taking place a decade or more after the events of Final Fight 1, Cody vanishes when he gets caught up in the criminal element of Metro City, lured by the prospect of being able to fight again via super steroids after he got old, I guess. I don't know. Everyone just keeps saying, Cody, your knees can't take it! Kyle then had to track down his brother in various boroughs throughout this far seedier version of Metro City, which is basically composed of 4 tiny hub worlds. Kyle's hood, the docks, Japantown, and Little Italy, where he eventually encounters both Hagar and Guy. Strangely enough, Capcom USA retconned Cody's prison stint again, saying that it was Guy that had committed another unspecified crime, and it was Cody who took the rap for it. Bro, please, just make up your mind. Anyway, during his downtime throughout this adventure, Kyle could also play annoying mini-games, perform fetch quests, and train and level up at a few gyms across the city. Finding these gyms was sometimes annoying because the maps weren't designed very well, as they're all largely composed of awkward sections that led to nowhere, along with everything looking very similar, which is to say drab and lifeless. Music was also a bummer too, as 90% of it was licensed metal and rap circa 2005, with only 2 to 3 remixes of classic Final Fight tunes. Where Streetwise excelled, well, where I mean it was better than you'd think, was in the combat, which was suitably punchy and impactful. There were a lot of attacks that Kyle could learn, including some taught by Hagar and Guy, which included the likes of suplexes, hurricane kicks, and various counter moves that could turn the tide of a fight rather quickly. These techniques would come in handy because some boss fights posed quite a challenge, and required you to figure out the right timing and distance to attack, while others were just exercises in frustration and patience. To try and attempt to keep the positives going, exploring the nooks and crannies of the dingy game world would sometimes yield fun little references and Easter eggs. You'll find mentions of various Capcom characters, the occasional old-school Mad Gear baddie would pop in. Hell, even Amaterasu from Okami makes a background appearance in Guy's dojo stage. But no cameo is more random than Cammy, who after a lot of time appears in one of the underground fight clubs, but also as a later boss in Streetwise's arcade mode. Ah yes, the arcade mode, which just so happens to be the last positive aspect I'd like to talk about. This mode presents something akin to what the earlier version of Streetwise, Seven Sons, was going for. The camera is on a rail system and shoots the action from a consistent angle, and offers a stripped-down beat-em-up brawl where all 4 characters are selectable. But unfortunately, they all play largely the same. But the real shame with this extra mode is that for the first 15 minutes, it's pretty fun, but it offers almost the exact same experience as Final Fight 1. You have a light attack button, a hard attack button, which when combined produces a Mega Crush, a throw button, and that's about it. All of the cool new moves that Kyle could gain in the main campaign don't transfer over here, so there's no instinct, counter moves, or dodges. What's worse is that the mode is pretty damn hard, at least when you're going solo, as the engine can push a lot of enemies on screen at once, who can quickly overwhelm you, and you only have 3 lives and no continues to deal with them. In co-op, it's doable, but still a hardy challenge, but I get that this is an arcade mode, but fuck me, could we not have gotten 3 lives and 3 continues? Would that have been okay? All of this just really bums me out, because if it had a few more tweaks, this mode could have redeemed the entire package. If there were a few comic book style cutscenes added at the start and the end, nothing fancy, the movesets getting diversified just a little bit more, and maybe you could have thrown in a smashing the car bonus round, and a proper end boss, and adjusting the... Okay, well now it seems like there's a lot you would needed to have done, but this still would have been pretty close to what I have wanted for a 6th generation Final Fight sequel. Unfortunately though, it's merely just the best part of a bad to mediocre PS2 action game. I try my best to see the silver lining within Streetwise, but it's always a struggle. Not only was this the last game in the series, its failure caused the complete closure of Production Studio 8, who also had a Maximo 3 in the works that we'll never see. Hell, even the port of Final Fight Arcade that was unlockable within Streetwise was one of the worst ever, which is something I'll get to next, along with the future of the entire series. Final Fight has been released, re-released, and released again, so I'd like to point out a few, but not all of the ports it's gotten over the decades. Final Fight 1 for the GBA was a neat little version that tried to right the wrongs of the Super NES botch job, and went even a little bit further beyond it. All the heroes were present. There was 2-player compatibility via the link cable, every stage was accounted for, it's pretty much everything you could want. Yeah, the screen was a little bit truncated, some of the graphics were washed out, and there's that bit-crushed GBA sound, but it still played really well and came loaded with extras. New pre-boss fight dialogue scenes were added, along with unlockable alpha versions of Cody and Guy. They even had their own unique cutscenes and dialogue. And on top of that, you could access a level select, change the number of lives, the punch speed, and even mess with costumes via a very basic color edit mode. In fact, the only real sore spot with FF1 is that Poison and Roxy were still not present. Goddamn, why were Capcom still not past this shit by this point? I mean, grow up! Okay, so as I stated back in the Streetwise section, an arcade ROM of Final Fight was unlockable and playable when you beat a certain boss, but playable might not be the most accurate descriptor. For whatever reason, it lagged like a hungover son of a bitch on a Monday morning, just dropping frames all over the place along with a general 20 FPS average, while also having a nasty filter applied to it that you couldn't turn off. But wait, there's more! There was also screen tearing, some sound emulation issues, and even the occasional example of corrupted graphics. Okay, I'm not sure how it was possible to botch a port of an 80s arcade game on a 2000s era console this badly, but bro, they found a way. With all that said, I don't know why you'd bother seeking out this version to play specifically, but if you are, I implore you to reconsider. Skipping past the old PS2 collections, Final Fight Double Impact was the first modern reissue of the arcade original that started it all, and remains a cool little package to this day. Not only did it have drop-in and drop-out co-op play via rollback netcode, there was a ton of extra supplementary material that you could earn via the Vault by completing certain in-game achievements. Stuff like this is mostly accessible right away in Capcom's most recent collections, but Double Impact kinda went above and beyond with it. While there was plenty of concept art, fan art, and comic book pages, the crown jewel was of course the full Final Fight episode of the Street Fighter animated series, something that's so very near and dear to my heart. To this day though, I'm still not sure why the double of Double Impact was Magic Sword of all things. Captain Commando would have made a lot more sense, but regardless, this release helped spearhead Capcom's move towards more digital collections, which is something I'll be eternally grateful for. Finally, there's the version included in the Capcom Beat 'em Up bundle, and you really can't go wrong with this one. It includes some extra developmental material, the rollback netcode, and is available on pretty much every modern platform, and of course comes with a bunch of other great brawlers like Knights of the Round, Armored Warriors, and the aforementioned Mr. Commando. Come to think of it, with this release and the fact that the Punisher was included in the recent Marvel collection, that now means all the classic Capcom beat-em-ups are now present and accounted for.
No one knows what it's like to be mistreated.
I've shouted out some fan game projects already, so why not list a few more? I got time. Final Fight LNS has been around for years, and while its impressive amount of characters and multiplayer capabilities are super cool, I do find it a little too different from classic Final Fight. While feature-rich, it strays into another category altogether, but if you're into beat-em-ups or fighting games in general, it makes for a good mindless time. I was initially really over the moon about Fight Forever when I first caught wind of test videos that started popping up online, which showed what was possible with this crazy new combat system, complete with FF2 Hagar chaining a ton of insane throws together. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Like, this is exactly what I wanted, a new 2D sprite-based Final Fight fan game with over-the-top mechanics, but either my expectations were misplaced from the start or the game's focus changed along the way, because now it seems to be veering into the LNS direction, as it's going to have a ton of characters that have nothing to do with Metro City. The Ninja Turtles, the dude from Tough Enough, and the less cooler version of Captain Commando, Sonic Blastman. Now, don't get me wrong, the game still looks awesome, and you can definitely see all the work put into it, but it's not really Final Fight either, you know? What is very Final Fight, though, is the 30th Anniversary Edition. That was, of course, not put out by Capcom, but instead passionate fans. This added 3-player simultaneous co-op with increased enemy health to compensate for it, as well as selectable costume colors, while preserving the original arcade content, all without cuts. What's more, incredibly, is that this is compatible with the original CPS-1 hardware, so if you have an authentic Final Fight cabinet in your garage, yeah, you can get this version working on it. There are, of course, dozens more fan games than the ones I listed here, so if you'd like to shout out a few in the comments below, feel free. Stepping back to take a wider view of the whole series now, Final Fight heroes and villains have appeared in a lot of other Capcom games over the years, especially on the streets, the Street Fighter Street, so let's break down their most notable inclusions. Mike Hagar starred in both Muscle Bomber / Saturday Night Slam Masters games, with Jessica in tow as his manager, and although he still has yet to appear in a single Street Fighter tournament, it is a nice consolation prize he was the only FF representative in the last 2 Marvel vs. Capcom clashes, and hey, they even gave him his midlife crisis ponytail look. Guy, Cody, Relento, and Sodom were of course all in the Alpha series, as well as both heroes making it into Super Street Fighter 4 and onward, only to be joined later by the tag team of Poison / Hugo, who debuted in Street Fighter 3. And Relento in Ultra Street Fighter 4, as I guess they were all desperate to get the fuck out of Cross Tekken only jail. Cody eventually reformed his ruffian ways in Street Fighter V, although oddly, Guy was MIA in that game. So in his place was Zeku, a former Bushinryu master who was only ever seen in one of Guy's alpha endings, which poses the question, is he a Street Fighter character or a Final Fight one? Poison and Lucia made surprise appearances in 5 as well, coming equipped with brand new looks and fighting styles to match that game's overhauled mechanics. But really, it was Abigail that made the most impact in 5 as the Final Fight rep, thanks to his insane model size and insanier kit, which let him get away with some very stupid stuff early on. Maki fortunately found her way into the world of Capcom vs SNK 2 and eventually Alpha 3, but sadly, those have been her only other appearances since. Like, she absolutely needs to come back someday. Notable by his absence in any major title though, is of course that crusty, bitter old Dean, who hasn't been seen since 1996. Carlos Miyamoto hasn't returned in playable form either, but he was fightable in the World Tour mode of Street Fighter 6, and weirdly, he's one of the few Final Fight characters that have. The Andore family is in there, and Thrasher/Damned is featured pretty prominently and is fightable as well, but like, that's it, despite the entire mode mostly taking place in Metro City. So like, Hagar, Cody, Guy, Poison, Hugo, Lucia, barely anyone is ever even mentioned, to the point it's kind of become awkward. I can only hope that the next season of Street Fighter 6 has at least 1 or 2 classic Final Fight heroes or villains included. Like, for example, did you know Sodom is the only character from the Alpha series that's never returned in a later Street Fighter game? Like, I just feel bad for the guy. You know what else I feel bad about though? It being 2026 and there being no new Final Fight entry in a time period where beat-em-ups are unquestionably back. Streets of Rage, Double Dragon, TMNT, Scott Pilgrim, hell, even the damn Brawl Brothers / Rushing Beat series is returning. And yet still, Capcom has done nothing significant with Final Fight outside of Street Fighter or the occasional upteenth release of the first game. Now, if some of you don't remember, way back in 2020, there was a leaked list of upcoming Capcom projects, and Capcom games tend to leak, like a lot. But the list stated that a new Final Fight was supposed to come out in 2024, so looking at my calendar here, you guys are a little late on that. We can only assume now that that list was total BS, which is probably true, or that the game was cancelled at some point, which is also probably true. Again, I'm not asking for some giant AAA RE engine powered open world sandbox thing. I just need a good looking 2D brawler that has impactful combat and updated mechanics and a nice mix of all the characters that we've adored and looked up to. Cause man, those are the heroes that saved our city. Alright, thank you to everyone that has made it this far into this video. I'm very aware that I talk about this particular hyperfixation quite a bit, but I hope you enjoyed this retrospective, maybe even learned something new. Oh, and a quick call to action here. If you ever find yourself on your social media of choice and you see Capcom either asking for feedback or announcing new titles, take a second out of your day and please just comment, "When's Final Fight?" It is one of my favorite franchises of all time. It is legendary. Any of you that have watched up until this point are legendary. And I am McMuscles, and I will see you next time.
Oh my God!